Welcome to episode number 2 of the Church Leadership Podcast here on YouTube. In this episode, my co-host Andy Frazier sits down and interviews me. And so I hope you enjoy my story and what we get to share together.
Welcome to the Church Leadership Podcast, your weekly source for encouraging and equipping local church leaders, with your hosts, Mark Gainey and Andy Frazier. In each episode, Andy and Mark sit down with church leaders that you should know. We believe these honest conversations will be helpful and encouraging to you as you lead the local church. Here is this week's episode.
We're so glad you've joined us today. It's a special occasion here. It's the second episode of Church Leadership Podcast, and on today's episode, I, Andy Frazier, your co-host, am going to interview our other co-host, Dr. Mark Gainey.
Woohoo!
Mark, we're glad you could join us on the show today.
Yes, such a pleasure.
Man, I don't know how we were able to swing this and get you on here, but we're thankful you've...
Glad my schedule cleared.
Yeah, we're glad that you did that for us. You made some time to join us today. So basically what we want to do is just share a little bit from our hearts so you can get to know us. We want our listeners who are investing time in this podcast to get to know Mark and I so that you can hear our stories. We believe each person we're going to interview on every episode has something that's just fantastic, something great, helpful, encouraging, insightful to share. And Mark, I believe...
Except this episode.
Well, I was going to say, I believe you're going to buck the system. And no, I've known Mark long enough to tell you guys there is no doubt Mark's story and Mark's passion for investing in church leaders is something you need to hear about, as well as to get to know him. It is encouraging to be his friend, to be around him, and to hear of all that God's doing in and through him. So, Mark, why don't you just begin our time together today by sharing a little bit about yourself, about your family, a little about your story.
Sure, man. I'd love to. And I'll start by saying that I am married to my wife, Tasha, and we've been married for 21 years. And, it's kind of funny. I think about how long we've been married, and I don't feel like I'm old enough to be married 21 years, but nonetheless, I am. And so we have been married for 21 years, and she is incredible. She's my rock and my support, and so I want to make sure that I say that first because that is legit. That's real. I'm not just saying that. And we've got 4 kids together, and our oldest is 17. We have 3 girls, 17-year-old girl, 15-year-old young lady, and a 11, almost 11. So by the time this podcast comes out, Anna will be 11. And then we have a boy who is 7. And so God has blessed us richly with these kids. Every one of them is different. And if you're a parent, you know...
no dull moments at your house.
No dull moments at the Gainey house.
Yeah.
No doubt about it. I mean, 3 girls, high drama, right? But they're awesome. God really has given us some incredible kids, and so we're thankful for them. I've been in ministry for, again, by the time this podcast comes out, I will have been in ministry for 20 years. And that's kind of nuts to think about, but that's the truth. So I've been in ministry for 20 years, and a lot like you, Andy, I've just about done everything you can do in ministry and beyond. But the one thing that I haven't done is I've never been a student pastor, and a lot of my friends have, but I didn't go that route. So I'll tell you a little bit about kind of that story and where that led to where we are now. But I didn't think I was going to be in ministry. That was not my plan. I have an older brother who's about 6 years older than me, and he knew he was going to be a pastor since he was 16 years old.
Wow.
And so, being a little brother, I didn't want to be like Big Brother. And so people would always ask me, hey, you going to go in the ministry? And I would be like, no way, man. There's no way I'm doing that. So I kind of bucked that a little bit. And honestly, God was calling me early on. I just kind of ignored that call in ministry, but eventually gave in. And so I went to Troy. Some things you need to know about me. I'm a huge Troy fan. And so we're sitting in my office right now and got some Troy stuff all over the walls. And so I went to Troy, huge Troy fanatic, go to a lot of games now. And a couple other things you need to know. I'm a huge Office fan, Parks and Rec fan, Seinfeld fan. That pretty much covers the gamut, except I'm a huge superhero fan. I'm a Marvel nut, and so I've got an Iron Man picture up in my office. I've got Spider-Man socks on today.
Yeah,
got these for Christmas.
With his pajamas, they match really well in your.
Oh, you like this onesie?
Yeah, it really looks nice.
Me. But anyway, so that's just kind of who I am a little bit. It informs a lot of who I am. But I went to school at Troy and got my major in entrepreneurship. Did not expect to go in ministry. Moved to Birmingham with a job after I got married, and so Tasha and I moved up here to Birmingham, and God called me into ministry while I was working in the corporate world, and so went to seminary. Didn't know what else to do, right? So I quit my job, went to seminary. Wouldn't do the same thing if I had to do it over, but Tasha was a teacher, and she put me through school, and got my master's degree, and immediately went into full-time ministry. Worked at a church in Birmingham, large church, and so I was on staff at a large church. We had 16 staff members at the time, kind of a dream team, honestly. Yeah. It was pretty awesome. And during that time, the church was praying about whether to plant a church or expand where they were or relocate. And, most of us on staff, we were really passionate about that church planting idea. And we thought, that'd be awesome to be part of that team. I had no idea that, never dreamt that I would be a senior pastor, a lead pastor. I was always going to be a kind of a supporting pastor. I was the outreach and missions guy at that church. But the church decided to relocate and, spend millions of dollars on a new facility. And that just wasn't my passion. And so I asked God, why did you do that? Why did you get me excited about that and then go in a different direction? And he kind of answered me through his Holy Spirit. And basically, it became clear that I was the one that was supposed to plant that church. I hadn't bargained for that. My wife didn't bargain for being a pastor's wife. But that's where God led us, and so we were I was a church planting pastor, and we were church planters for 9.5 years. Part of that time was bivocational, and so I've done everything you can imagine.
Let me ask you something, Mark. I'll interrupt, but what did you do with all your extra money and time while you were doing that? So.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
Oh, man. The hardest thing I've ever done.
Yeah, it is hard.
It was the hardest thing I've ever done. It was the most rewarding at times. Mm-hmm. But, most of the gray hair I have, I think, comes from that and having teenagers now. But
it must be nice to have hair, by the way. Go ahead. Continue on.
I am glad, but even if it is green. But so we were church planters for 9.5 years and ups and downs, roller coaster of church planting. If you're a church planter, you know what that's like. But ultimately, it did not grow like we expected. The plan was you read all the books, right? You start with 60 people or 100 people, and you got 2,000 in 2 years, right? Well, it didn't go that way with us.
Everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth.
That's right.
Isn't that what Mike Tyson said?
That's exactly what Mike Tyson said. A little more nasally, high-pitched voice in that lisp, but that's what he said.
Right.
But anyway, so our church plant, by God's standards, would be successful. People came to Christ, people were discipled, but by every other standard, it was a failure. And honestly, that was the one thing that I feared more than anything else was failure, and that's what drove me. I'll be honest with you; it wasn't the desire to be successful because I wanted God to be glorified in those days. I was afraid to fail. And so it led me to some poor decisions at the time. And so I was bivocational, and so really I had about 4 jobs at one time, and trying to make ends meet.
Your side hustle had a side hustle. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly right. That's exactly right. And so I took on too much, quite honestly, and took on one thing after another, and, in my pride and arrogance said, I can do that, no problem. In fact, one person asked me, are you sure you're able to handle this? And my answer was, yeah, I can handle this.
Of course
I can. Well, I couldn't. And I began to make bad decisions and made compromises. And quite honestly, it's kind of funny. I was preaching a sermon series on Jonah about running from God, and I was running from God as fast as I could. Made some really poor choices, began to neglect my family, neglect my marriage, and eventually lost some of my other jobs because of the result of some of my decisions, and realized that I was in a bad place. And so I just voluntarily stepped out of ministry and said, I can't do this. In fact, I didn't think I would ever go back into ministry. And so I guess that's what people call burnout, and that's really what it is. I call it sin because it was just selfishness and sin. And it was a rough patch. It was a rough time in our lives, but it was the sweetest time of my marriage, believe it or not. I'd made some poor decisions, but God woke me up in time to realize you need to focus on your marriage and your family first.
That's great.
And your relationship. There. It is. Focus on your relationship with Jesus. And so that's what I did. And, I wasn't making hardly anything in the jobs I was working at the time. But during that time, God allowed me to do what I always dreamt of doing and thought would never happen because I was in ministry. He allowed me to start my own business. And so I started a web design and development company, social media marketing company. God bless that. And in that time, again, I never thought I'd be back in the ministry. Well, I had some people who loved me enough to be honest with me and say, God never revokes his call. And so there was an opening of a little bitty church in Montevallo, Alabama, and they were needing an interim pastor. And I was stubborn, and I tried to run from that too for a very little time. But, my wife convinced me that maybe this is how God wanted us to get back in the ministry possibly. And so got back in the ministry as a part-time, bivocational interim pastor in Mayberry Baptist Church, believe it or not. That's the name of the church. And our family almost doubled attendance when we walked in the doors. That's how small it was. But God used that to get me back in the ministry. Eventually, another church called and said, hey, we want to talk to you about being our pastor. And I said, well, I've got my own business. And they said, yeah, we know that, but we want you as a full-time pastor. And so we kind of gave away a lot of our business at that time because God called us back into full-time ministry and in a place we never thought we'd be. And here's the thing. God, he's got a trend with me the last 3 places I've served. And that trend is he calls us to a place that's in need of revitalization. And so, I guess that's that church planting mindset. It's almost like a replant kind of thing. And so we served at 3 churches the last several years. Every one of them was a revitalization project. Some were easier than others, but we love where we are now. We're serving at a church in Fultondale, Alabama, which is just north of Birmingham. It's a suburb right north of Birmingham. We love the city. Our family's here in Birmingham, and so we've seen some awesome things in the last few years. And after what I've been through, after seeing God's grace in my life, and God's still choosing to use me, which is nuts to me. I mean, every day I still think this is crazy. God, you're using me. That's crazy. And so it's just a joy. It is a joy to be in ministry. It's a joy to be used, and I'm just thankful.
Isn't it great how during those rough patches, those valleys, how we feel the nearness of God more to the end than any other time? I mean, our awareness of our need for Him and His grace. So I think your story will probably hit home with a lot of people who are listening to this, who are church leaders who have gone through rough times and maybe doubted their call. But along with your story that you shared with us today, Mark, is there something in your experience, in your relationship with Jesus, or in your family, or your time in ministry, maybe something that God has taught you that was like you look back and you're like, oh man, I can't believe I did that. If I could do something over. Do you have any suggestions or any helpful insight to people who you don't want them to make the same mistakes you did?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say first, don't ignore the red flags. They're there, okay? And if you've got red flags in your ministry, in your life right now, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And you've got that other side, that voice in you trying to justify everything you do. Oh, I'm doing it because of this. I'm doing it because of that. And we can make it spiritual. Oh, well, I'm sacrificing for the ministry. Yeah, right, whatever. Don't ignore the red flags. God puts them in your life for a reason. I remember thinking about a red flag in my life those, several years ago when all this was going on. And, I mean, literally, I remember thinking that this is probably a red flag by God. I mean, I remember thinking that. And I remember thinking I should leave this specific job and position. I felt like my time there, not in ministry, but this was my other job, my time there was done, and I could feel myself making compromises. And I knew I needed to leave, but I didn't because I was too comfortable. And I ignored the red flag, and one led to the other, to the other, to the other, and they're easier to ignore once you begin to ignore them. And so I guess the first thing I would tell you is, listen, if there's a red flag in your life, listen. God put it there for a reason.
Yes.
The second thing I would say is make sure that you're honest with those people who surround you. I was not. I had people in my life. I had an accountability group, right? I was a good pastor. I had an accountability group, but I wasn't honest with them. I was really good at hiding the things that I didn't want them to see. And so what I would just tell you is, that's just garbage. If you have that in your life, that's garbage. Don't do that. Don't lie to the people, or don't deceive the people. Don't pretend for them like everything's okay. God has put those people in your life, your spouse, that leadership team in your church, whoever you've surrounded yourself to hold you accountable. And by the way, if you don't have somebody holding you accountable, get someone to hold you accountable.
Immediately.
Yes, immediately.
Yes. Somebody trustworthy.
That's right. That's right. So I would say those two things are huge. But, it's funny, we did your episode in the first podcast episode, and the lessons that you and I have learned are both very similar, but in a different way. I tend to learn the hard way, and like you, I have failed more than I've succeeded, and God has taught me a lot about life through failure and to embrace failure. But I would say that one of the lessons I've learned is again similar to what you said. Don't neglect your walk with Jesus. I was a pastor, and I would neglected my walk with Jesus. I was so focused on others. That sounds spiritual. It's not. I was selfishly focused on others, that I neglected my walk with Jesus. And I neglected the other relationships that are vital and most important. I neglected my relationship with my wife. I neglected my family for a time. And I would just tell you, if you're in a position where the demands of your job, if you're bivocational, the demands of your ministry, if you're full-time in ministry or bivocational, if the demands of your life are causing you to make decisions that A, neglect your relationship with Jesus, and B, neglect your relationship with your family, then stop.
That's right.
That means quit, change your schedule, reprioritize your life, whatever it takes. And I know that sounds harsh, but believe me, coming from somebody on the other side of going through that burnout and that heartache, let me tell you, do whatever it takes.
That's right.
To prioritize your relationship with Jesus and your relationship with your family.
Yeah, I think Jesus told us something about the severity of that, cutting off hands and plucking out eyes.
He was a little extreme on that too, wasn't he? Absolutely.
And that's the conviction of the Holy Spirit. That's not just your conscience or, awareness. That is the Holy Spirit at work in you as a believer.
That's exactly right.
Key. Absolutely. Well, what are some things, Mark, that maybe that might encourage us and help us a little bit? Maybe some things that God has given you a passion for, or maybe some special opportunities that you've seen Him do some things in and through you or around you that maybe might be helpful to us as well.
Well, the greatest transformation I have witnessed in any place or church I've served in is just through personal disciple making. And so I would say one of the mistakes I made early on was I waited to make disciples. I remember when I first got out of college, I was involved in disciple making early on, and two people poured their life into me in college, and so I got bit by the bug of making disciples early. And I remember going to the local church after I graduated college and sharing it with a leader there, and so excited. And they said, "Well, that doesn't work that way in the local church," and it just kind of bummed me out, And so eventually I was convinced that he was right. Of course, he wasn't, but so I made the mistake of waiting to make disciples until much later in my ministry career. And so don't wait to make disciples. And if you have never been discipled, find somebody to disciple you. And if you don't know anybody, then Andy and I can point you in the right direction to somebody.
Absolutely.
We've got lots of friends, and personally, we are involved in that. And so,
we can leave an opportunity for you to comment or give us a message or give us some feedback, not just on our podcast, which, by the way, if you would like to go to iTunes and subscribe to our podcast and leave reviews, that would be very helpful.
That would be awesome.
Yes.
Go to iTunes, you go to Stitcher, Yeah.
Any of those ways that you're listening to podcast, if you will subscribe and leave some positive comments for us as we move along in this, it will help us tremendously to get the word out.
That's right. That's right.
But Mark, you're spot on. You're dead on in allowing us to see not only into your life, but also as a reflection. It's a mirror letting us see in our own life. We need the Holy Spirit's convicting power. We need others who we can be honest with, and we give them permission to be honest with us as well. And investing in others through disciple making is key. As a matter of fact, it's not just necessary for church leaders. It's necessary for every person who considers themselves to be a Christian to be involved in some type of disciple making. They need to be a disciple, and they need to be involved in making disciples. So that's something you're going to hear a lot from us here on this podcast. You're going to hear a lot about disciple making and discipleship and disciples. So we feel like as church leaders, that's our mandate, our greatest mission and calling. And the mistakes you and I both made over the years, I think 99.99% of them would be solved if we properly were making disciples at that time in our ministry. Wouldn't you agree?
If we were a disciple who was making disciples,
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I think I can speak for both of us in this, Andy. We both have a dual calling that we have discovered, and you mentioned it in the episode we interviewed you, but the dual calling really is not only to lead a local church, but we're also called to pour into the lives of local church leaders. That's why we're doing this podcast, and that's led to a lot of other things. In fact, I mentioned my business earlier. God has really kind of continued that in a different direction the last few months and last year, and so we started a church consulting company to pour into the life of leaders called Incite Ministries, and we have the same passion and vision and scope in equipping and encouraging church leaders in that venue too. So,
since you're the tech guy and I'm not, I'm just going to go out on a limb and guess you're going to leave some kind of link to Incite Ministries and anything we've talked about in today's episode in our show notes.
We will put that in the show notes. Yes,
okay.
We will.
All right. Well, Mark, thank you so much for giving of your time today and sharing your story. A lot of people, it's hard maybe for them to share about their failures. I know you and me, we joke a lot about our failures, but we've learned a lot through our failures. And I pray you've also been encouraged by Mark's story today. And we hope as you've listened to this podcast and you continue to listen to further episodes that you as a leader in God's local church can be encouraged and equipped. Thank you for joining us today.
See you guys. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Church Leadership Podcast. We hope you'll join us again next week.